In April 1960, a 25-year-old woman named Irene Garza disappeared after going to confess at a local church in the city of McAllen, Texas, USA. Irene was known for her kindness and generosity, often using her own money to help her students buy school supplies. She worked as a second-grade teacher and, during the tragic Easter weekend of 1960, her life met a painful end. A large search effort took place in the city, and just a few days after her disappearance, Irene's body was found in an irrigation canal on the outskirts. An investigation into the case was opened, but, inexplicably, it was quickly closed and faded from media attention. The main suspect was a priest from the church where Irene had gone to confession. More than 4 decades later, in 2002, suspicions were confirmed, revealing that the priest was indeed responsible for the crime. Irene's family and some city residents never doubted the priest's guilt, pointing out that many clues had been ignored, allowing the culprit to go unpunished for many years. Irene Garza was born on November 15, 1934, in McAllen, Texas, into a family of Mexican descent. She stood out in the city as the first Latina to achieve certain milestones, something significant in a community near the Mexican border and marked by a strong Hispanic cultural presence. Her heritage and personal achievements reflected a pioneering spirit and a dedication to education and community, which made her disappearance and death even more impactful for everyone who knew her. To continue exploring this story, it is important to dive into the details of Irene's life, the events that led to her tragic end, and the pursuit of justice that took decades to be realized. Public engagement with content like this is always welcome, whether through likes, subscribing to channels covering such narratives, or comments that enrich the discussion. Now, let's delve into the events that shocked McAllen and the path that led to the delayed resolution of this case. Irene Garza, daughter of Nicolas Garza and Josefina Cisneros Garza, grew up in a family that owned a small laundry business in McAllen, Texas. Although it was not a large enterprise, the business gradually prospered, allowing the family to improve their standard of living. As a result of this financial success, they moved to the northern part of the city when Irene was a teenager. The city, like many others at the time, was heavily segregated, with people of Mexican and Latino descent living predominantly in the south, while wealthier white Americans resided in the north. Irene, however, maintained her humility and generosity, qualities that made her beloved by the community. At McAllen High School, Irene stood out not only for her beauty but also for her academic and social achievements, such as being the first Latina to join the school's marching band and being elected band queen by her classmates in 1951. After finishing high school, she enrolled at Pan American College in Edinburgh, where she won a beauty contest and was crowned prom queen in 1958. Starting her career as a second-grade teacher at an elementary school on the south side of McAllen, Irene continued to show her dedication and love for the community. She often worked late preparing lessons and bought school supplies with her own money to give to needy students. Additionally, Irene was appointed secretary of the school's Parent-Teacher Association, highlighting her success and commitment to education. Irene always had a strong connection to the Catholic Church and, as part of her routine, attended the Sacred Heart Church, where she also participated in the Legion of Mary. She was known for her consistent presence at Mass and for regularly going to confession on Saturdays. On the Saturday before Easter Sunday in 1960, Irene spent the afternoon preparing sweets and gifts for her students and family. On the evening of April 16th, she decided to go to church to confess, as was her custom, and borrowed her parents' car. Leaving home around 6:30 p.m., she planned to return quickly, but as the night went on and she didn't come back, her parents began to worry. They knew about Irene's involvement with the church and initially believed she might have decided to stay for the Easter Vigil Mass, which would last until nearly midnight. However, their concern grew when she did not return after that Mass. The situation became alarming when it was already 3 a.m. and Irene still hadn't come back. Nicholas, her father, decided to go to the church to investigate. When he arrived, he found the family car parked there, which he thought was extremely strange. Even more concerning was that there was no sign of Irene inside the church or nearby. This moment marked the beginning of a distressing search for the young teacher, which would culminate in the tragic discovery of her body days later, and in a mystery that would last for decades. Worried about his daughter's disappearance, Irene's father went to the McAllen police station in the early morning of April 17th, Easter Sunday, to report the incident. Accompanied by officers, he went to the place where the family car was parked, but they found nothing suspicious. The police then contacted Irene's friends, including Sylvia, who reported having received a call from Irene inviting her to go to confession on Saturday, but Sylvia was not home at the time and therefore did not accompany Irene. On Sunday morning, witnesses who had been at the church the night before said they saw Irene praying in a pew, standing out because of her presence and beauty. One person mentioned she was wearing a white veil, while another described her outfit: a lilac blouse, a floral skirt, beige high-heeled shoes, and a small black purse. The church was very crowded due to the Easter celebrations, which made the eyewitness accounts less precise. A woman reported that Irene asked if she could go ahead in line at the confessional because she was running late. Other witnesses said they saw Irene enter the rectory building near the church, which was unusual since confession was supposed to take place in the confessional. It was later discovered that a priest named John Fite was the one who heard Irene's confession in the rectory, a fact considered highly suspicious. During Sunday, intense searches were conducted throughout the area, with friends and relatives combing roads and rural areas but to no avail. Heavy rain that started on Sunday also hampered the search. However, on Monday, April 18th, clues began to emerge. A teacher found a black leather purse on the edge of a dirt road that contained Irene's driver's license. The police, seeing the dirty purse, deduced it had not simply been thrown there, but lost during the storm the previous day. With this discovery, the search focused on the area where the purse was found. Police officers, some on horseback, thoroughly searched the nearby rural areas. About 300 meters further, they found a beige high-heeled shoe and a white veil, the same items described by witnesses who saw Irene at church. The presence of these belongings along the roadside, with a considerable distance between them, suggested to the police that something tragic had happened to Irene in that area. These clues were crucial for continuing the investigation and for the eventual discovery of what happened to Irene Garza. The McAllen police began to suspect that Irene Garza had been the victim of a serious crime, especially after finding her belongings scattered along a dirt road. The arrangement of the items suggested someone had thrown them out of a moving car window. Initially, the police considered the possibility that Irene had run away with a boyfriend, but this theory did not fit her profile, a woman dedicated to her work and school community. A friend of Irene's brought up a letter she had received a week earlier mentioning that Irene was dating two young men, a term that actually referred to casual contacts. Irene also mentioned that her ex-boyfriend had sent her a letter accompanied by chocolates and flowers on the previous Valentine's Day, which had emotionally affected her. Despite this information, the letter did not lead to concrete clues because the names of those involved were not mentioned. What caught the police's attention was the letter's conclusion, where Irene wrote that she was no longer afraid of death. This, combined with rumors that began to circulate about a priest, led the police to consider other possibilities. However, at that time, There was no formal investigation against any priest in the city. During the search, some false leads and hoaxes emerged. A woman called Irene's family, claiming to be her and stating that she had been kidnapped and held at a hotel in the neighboring city of Hidalgo. The police, upon verifying the information, discovered it was a cruel prank and that no one was at the hotel. Another false lead came from a waitress in Edinburgh, who reported hearing from a tourist that he had taken Irene's life and that she should be careful because she might be next. The police identified the man and took him in for questioning, but he apologized, claiming he had made up the story. These incidents only increased the anguish of the family and investigators, who continued the search for Irene without finding concrete clues or evidence pointing to a specific suspect. Suspicion about a priest was still just a rumor among residents, with no backing from a formal investigation, mainly due to the trust people placed in the church at that time. The man who had confessed to the crime claimed he was under the influence of alcohol and that it was all just a joke, and he was released by the police for lack of evidence. The investigation continued, and on Thursday, April 21st, shortly after 7:30 a.m., the police received a report about a body floating in an irrigation canal a few kilometers from where Irene's belongings had been found. Upon arriving at the scene, they identified a woman, still clothed, with her shirt partially open. The suspicion that it was Irene was confirmed hours later by a family member. The autopsy revealed that Irene had been suffocated. She also showed signs of having been struck on the head, which likely rendered her unconscious before being thrown into the canal. The condition of the body indicated she had been dead for about 4 days, suggesting she had been held captive for at least 1 day before being murdered. Irene's death deeply shocked the McAllen community, and the county sheriff promised tireless efforts to find the person responsible. The police identified tire marks and a shoe print with hair near the canal, but the technology at the time did not allow for DNA testing, and heavy rain had washed away many other possible pieces of evidence. More than 500 people were interviewed, including known criminals, suspects, ex-boyfriends, and friends of Irene. Some were subjected to polygraph tests, but no suspect stood out. The police also offered a reward that started at $500 and was increased to $10,000, but without significant success. The police then turned their attention to the church, the last known place where Irene was seen alive. They managed to map nearly everyone who was at the church that night, thanks to a sign-in book that recorded the presence of the faithful. This allowed them to interview everyone present and reconstruct how confessions were taking place that night. This phase of the investigation was crucial to better understand the events that led to Irene's disappearance and to begin clarifying the role of Father John Fite, who heard her confession in an unusual location, the rectory, instead of the traditional confessional. During the investigation into Irene Garza's disappearance and death, the police discovered that 3 local priests and a visiting priest, 27-year-old John Bernard Fite, were at the church on the night of April 16th. Witnesses reported seeing Irene enter the rectory, which was unusual since confessions were typically held elsewhere. When questioned, the police learned that John Fite had heard Irene's confession in the rectory. Initially, when questioned by the police, John Fite denied hearing Irene's confession there. However, after being confronted with witness statements, he admitted to hearing her confession in the rectory but stated that after the confession, he returned to the church and did not know where Irene had gone. Witnesses, however, reported that the confessions were taking longer than usual that night, precisely because John Fite left the church several times, displaying strange and seemingly worried behavior. The priest was subjected to a polygraph test, but the result was inconclusive. The lack of a clear response from the lie detector and John Fite's suspicious behavior raised even more questions about his involvement in the case. Despite this, at that time, The police did not have enough evidence to arrest or charge him. The investigation continued, but the way John Fite escaped immediate accusation is truly surprising, considering the evidence that began to mount against him. After the Easter Vigil Mass on Saturday night into Sunday, other priests noticed that John Fite had scratches on his hands and arms. He explained the injuries by claiming he had broken his glasses and needed to climb the wall of his house in San Juan to retrieve a spare pair. However, this explanation did not align with reports that he had left the church multiple times during the confessions. Another suspicious detail was John Fite's use of the parish car several times on Sunday, which was unusual for such a busy day at the church. 2 weeks after Irene was found, the police drained the canal where her body had been discovered and found a Kodak slide viewer and a candelabrum from the Sacred Heart Church. John Fite was identified as the owner of the slide viewer, but he claimed not to know how the item ended up in the canal. Despite the suspicions, the police were unable to arrest John Fite because there was no concrete evidence directly linking him to the crime. In 1960, technology and resources were limited, and Fite denied all accusations. The local media covered the case extensively, and it was discovered that, weeks before Irene's disappearance, on March 23, 1960, a 20-year-old woman named Maria America Guerra was attacked in a church in Edinburgh. Maria identified Fite as her assailant, and after a new polygraph test, he was charged with assault. When they tried to arrest him on August 5, 1960, he had disappeared but returned weeks later, and it was revealed that he had been sent to a treatment clinic for priests with inappropriate behavior, run by the church itself. Surprisingly, he was not detained. He only paid bail and returned to the clinic. Rumors of a conspiracy between the church and the authorities to protect the image of the religious institution began to circulate. The Irene case stopped being reported, and Fite's trial for the attack on Maria was moved to another county. The trial in September 1961 ended in a hung jury, with no verdict, and a second trial was scheduled for March 1962. At no point was John Fite sent to prison, which further fueled suspicions that there was an attempt to cover up the case. One of the church priests, Joseph O'Brien, reportedly reassured Irene's family, promising that if Fite was guilty, the church would make him pay in a way that, in O'Brien's words, would be much worse than secular justice could impose. After the first trial, John Fite was sent to a monastery in Missouri, an isolated place intended for problematic priests, managed by the church itself. Before the second trial, he entered a no-contest plea, which resulted in a light sentence, a $1,000 fine plus court costs. This outcome fueled speculation that a deal had been made between the church and the justice system to close the Irene Garza case. From 1963 to 1970, John Fite's life was marked by a series of transfers between different monasteries, where he had less freedom than he would have had in a regular parish. In 1970, he requested dispensation from the priesthood, married a woman he met in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and had 3 children. Later, in 1979, he moved to Phoenix, Arizona, where he led a relatively normal life, working in insurance sales and later for a church-affiliated charity organization. Irene's family had lost hope that the case would be resolved. However, in 2002, a monk from the Missouri monastery, where John Fite had confessed the crimes to him, decided it was time to reveal what he knew. This monk, who had heard Fite's confession about the crimes against Irene Garza and Maria America Guerra, brought to light crucial information that had been kept secret for decades. This revelation reignited interest in the Irene Garza case, which had been shelved and forgotten by the authorities. The monk's confession provided the missing proof linking John Fite to Irene's murder. Although Fite could no longer be tried for the crime due to the passage of time, This confession helped bring some justice and closure to Irene's family, confirming their long-held suspicions about the real culprit. The monk in question was known as Deo Peter Tesson. He established communication with the police and shared information about John Fay, revealing that Fay had confessed to kidnapping a young woman, taking her to the rectory basement where he abused and tied her up. John reportedly mentioned that at one point the victim complained of difficulty breathing, and when he returned from church, she had already died. He then placed the body in a vehicle and transported it to a canal. Deo Peter Tesson recounted these events, but John did not specify the victim's name or the location where the crime took place. In 2002, Deo Peter Tesson contacted the authorities in San Antonio, Texas, where John Fay had entered the priesthood. However, the Irene case was not related to San Antonio, which delayed the investigation. Only after a more thorough inquiry was the police able to establish the connection between the monk, John Fay, and the name Irene through Father Joseph O'Brien. The latter, who held a leadership position at the Sacred Heart Church in McAllen, confirmed that John Fay had confessed to the crime in 1960. Despite these revelations, Hidalgo County District Attorney Renee Guerra, who had been in office since 1980, refused to take the case to a new jury, citing flaws in the original investigation, lack of evidence after so many years, and the fact that Father Joseph O'Brien was suffering from health issues. This decision caused great outrage among Irene's family, whose parents had already passed away in the 1990s, but who still had cousins and other living relatives. The case was shelved again, and in 2005, Father Joseph O'Brien passed away. Nearly a decade later, in 2014, a judge named Ricardo Rodriguez led a campaign to replace DA Renee Guerra, using the Irene Garza case as an electoral strategy. He promised that if elected, he would give proper attention to the case. After winning the election, he took office in January 2015 and, in April of that year, announced the reopening of the case, fulfilling his campaign promise. In February 2016, former priest John Fay was arrested in Scottsdale, Arizona, at the age of 85. After his arrest, he was extradited to Texas and held at a detention center in Hidalgo County. The issue of bail sparked a legal battle. The prosecution suggested bail set at $50,000, while John Fay's defense proposed $100,000. The judge, however, set bail significantly higher at $1 million. The case continued to unfold in court, with the defense attempting to change the trial venue to another county, a request that was denied by the judge in March 2017. That same month, monk Deo Peter Tesson testified against John Fay in a closed-door deposition. The trial began on November 28, 2017, with various witnesses, including police officers, family members, and friends of Irene Garza, providing testimony. John Fay, already weakened by age, was present throughout the trial. On December 7, 2017, John Fay was found guilty, with only the sentencing left to be determined. The defense requested probation, arguing that he was ill and had no other convictions since the crime against Irene. The prosecution, on the other hand, requested a symbolic sentence of 57 years in prison, corresponding to the number of years since the crime occurred. However, on December 8, the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment. John Fay was sent to a prison near Huntsville, Texas, where he passed away on February 12, 2020, just over 2 years after his conviction. The case took 57 years to be solved and to result in John Fay's conviction, who for decades lived as if nothing had happened. Thank you for following along this far.